Further ado, let's start this session. Hello, everyone. I am Poornima. I welcome you all on behalf of the chair to today's discussion on a very relevant global topic, that is the ongoing US-Israel-Iran war. And today we will view it through the lens of West Asian or the Middle Eastern states, particularly the Gulf states, that now find themselves on the front line of a conflict they did not initiate but are deeply impacted by. We are into the fourth week of the war, and as these Gulf countries balance security threats, economic disruption, and strategic uncertainty from attacks on their military as well as civilian infrastructure to risks to energy flows and trade routes, today's conversation will unpack how regional governments are navigating this crisis and what it means for the broader regional geopolitical landscape. And to discuss this, we have the pleasure of having Mr. Giorgio Cafiero as our speaker of the day. This webinar is part of the monthly series by the Subhas Chandra Bose Chair on International Relations, Chanakya University. And to say briefly about the chair, it's an initiative of the School of Law, Governance and Public Policy at Chanakya University. The chair represents a pioneering initiative poised to redefine the discourse surrounding the dynamic complexities of 21st century international relations by fostering collaboration among a diverse network of stakeholders. It endeavors to cultivate a distinct knowledge base founded on evidence-based research, laying the groundwork for India's evolving role on the world stage. As a vanguard research platform, the chair aspires to set and correct the agenda for international relations in Asia. The chair is headed by Mr. Ashok Kanta, former career diplomat who served as the Secretary in Ministry of External Affairs and Ambassador High Commissioner of India to China, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. Um, Neighborhood international relations is the core focus of the chair, and with West Asia or the Middle East being part of our extended neighborhood, this topic would be one of global relevance and to India as well. We are very glad to have you all here. Without further ado, allow me to please introduce our speaker. Mr. Giorgio Cafiero is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a Washington, D.C.-based geopolitical risk consultancy. He is also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University and an adjunct fellow at the American Security Project. Mr. Cafiero is a frequent contributor to think tanks and media outlets such as the Atlantic Council, Arab Gulf States Institute, Stimson Center, Gulf International Forum, the New Arab and Media. Throughout his career, Mr. Cafiero has consulted many public and private security entities, briefed diplomats from various countries on Gulf affairs, and worked as a subject matter expert for multinational law firms. Mr. Cafiero holds an MA in International Relations from the University of San Diego. Thank you for accepting our invite, sir. Participants can type in their questions relevant to today's topic. That will be largely a West Asian perspective through the course of the webinar. We will open for questions at the end, where you can also choose to orally ask your questions. So starting off, my first question to you, sir. As the conflict subsides, GCC states will need to recalibrate their approach to Iran amid lingering security concerns as well as economic risks. My question is, how are the GCC states likely to approach Iran after all the dust settles?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be with all of you, and there's no doubt that we have so many important issues to get into in light of this war that broke out in the Middle East 27 days ago. Your first question about how the Arab Gulf monarchies are going to approach Iran in the future, so much to get into. I think probably it would be good to go back a couple of years and put this in a little bit of a historic context in which we look at how the policies of the first Trump administration initially prompted some of the GCC member states to recalibrate their approach to dealing with what they perceived to be an Iranian threat. When Donald Trump's first term began in early 2017, some of the GCC states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, were optimistic that with the Obama presidency over and the Trump presidency about to begin, Washington would start to deal with Iran in manners that were more aligned with the interests of GCC states that felt as if the Obama administration had failed to really appreciate what they saw as a grave threat represented by Tehran. And so from an early point in Trump's first term, the Saudis, Bahrainis, and Emiratis were enthusiastic about the maximum pressure, so-called maximum pressure campaign. And in May 2018, those three GCC states and Israel were the only four countries in the world that hailed Trump's decision to pull the United States unilaterally out of the JCPOA and then impose sanctions on Iran that were very crippling to the Iranian economy. What followed was a tense situation in which Iran's back was up against the wall, and Iran essentially decided to lash out at countries in the neighborhood that collaborated with the Trump administration's maximum pressure policies. And so in May of 2019, there were some acts of sabotage carried out off the UAE's east coast. And 4 months later, September 2019, there was the famous Aramco attacks that took place. These attacks on GCC states were obviously linked to Iran, and in the aftermath of the Saudi Aramco attacks, the Trump administration was asked if it was going to do anything against Iran to defend Saudi Arabia. And Trump famously said, well, that was an attack on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, not an attack on the United States. So no, we're not going to do anything about it. I think the key takeaway in the Gulf at that point was that the GCC states had backed up Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and they were the ones targeted when Iran lashed out. But the United States, as the security guarantor in the Gulf, had failed to have their back when Iran lashed out at them. This marked the beginning of a new period in which the UAE and later Saudi Arabia started to engage Iran diplomatically. The thinking was, if Iran represents a threat, but the United States is not going to have our back when it comes to facing that threat, then the most logical thing to do would be to engage the Iranians in a dialogue and try to find local solutions to local tensions. In the second half of 2019, Abu Dhabi began engaging Iran. And then in April 2021, under Iraqi and Omani auspices, the Saudis entered into talks with Tehran that eventually manifested in the renormalization of Saudi-Iranian diplomatic relations through a famous agreement signed in March 2023 in China. From that point on, the overall trend in GCC-Iran relations was toward détente. There was no rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The two countries remained very suspicious of the other, and tensions were still there, but both countries, based on their understandings of their own national interests, determined that it was best to mitigate and contain the tensions rather than escalate them. And the Saudi-Iranian détente proved very resilient even after the Israeli war on Gaza and all the aftermath of that conflict began in October 2023. One of the reasons why Saudi Arabia and the UAE were very determined to maintain this state of détente with Iran had to do with their concerns that if the US or Israel would bomb Iran and trigger a regional war, they were scared that they could get caught up and be collateral damage in that type of conflict. And so the GCC states wanted to try to do everything they could to make sure that if a war would break out between Israel / the US on one side and Iran on the other, that they would be able to fortress their countries from the chaotic fallout of such a conflict. And in the lead up to this war that did erupt on February 28th, the Saudis and others in the GCC tried to convince the Trump administration not to bomb Iran because they took very seriously Iran's threats to target US military bases on their soil in the event of Israel or the US waging such operations against Iran. We should also note that in June of last year, June 2025, when the 12-day war between Israel and Iran was going on, there was that episode after the second Trump administration waged Midnight Hammer, in which Iran retaliated by firing missiles and drones at the Al Udeid air base in Qatar. What we need to appreciate, though, is that Iranian attack on the base in Qatar, which hosts US CENTCOM's forward headquarters, was a very choreographed and pre-signaled attack. The concern in all 6 GCC states was that if the 12-day war would unfreeze and Iran would be bombed again, the Iranians might lash out against targets in a Gulf country, but not do it in a choreographed or pre-signaled manner, and that the retaliation against targets on the Arabian Peninsula could be much more intense. Unfortunately, and very tragically for the Gulf Arabs, all of their concerns over the past 27 days proved to be very valid and very legitimate. After the United States and Israel began their operations against Iran on February 28th, the Iranians immediately carried out missile and drone attacks against the GCC countries. But these attacks against the GCC states went way beyond what I think even Gulf Arab officials were fearing. Rather than just attacking US military bases, Iran has also attacked civilian infrastructure in these countries: hotels, maritime ports, commercial airports, apartment complexes, and even in one case in Bahrain, a desalination plant. So why did Iran do this? While I find it from a moral standpoint to be indefensible, we do have to recognize that there is a strategic rationale for this destabilizing conduct. Iran right now wants to make the United States pay a very, very high price for its decision to attack Iran. The Iranians are not interested in just coming to another ceasefire like what we saw in late June 2025, only for the ceasefire to give the Americans and Israelis an opportunity to sort of regroup and re-strategize and then attack Iran later. The leadership in Tehran wants to achieve deterrence capacity and make the US pay such a high price for its decision to wage these operations against Iran, to the point that Trump and any of his successors will never ever consider bombing Iran again. So to do this, Tehran is trying to disrupt the global economy to the maximum extent possible. And this will obviously have an impact on the US economy. So this is the strategic rationale behind targeting these military and high revenue generating civilian sites in the Gulf states, as well as imposing a de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The goal, again, is to disrupt the global economy so that everyone in the world associates the US bombing of Iran with major economic problems felt all over the world, certainly in the United States too. However, this is a very high-stakes gamble for Iran, and it's come at the expense of that détente with the GCC states that I was talking about right now. So really, to get to your question, now that we sort of put this in a little bit of context, the GCC states now sense more of a threat than ever from Iran. I would probably say that now, more than any point since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 that led to the formation of this current government in Tehran, the GCC members view Iran as now the most predatory and aggressive Iran that they've ever had to deal with. They, however, want to see to it that there is not further escalation of this conflict. These countries want to see stability restored in the neighborhood as quickly as possible. The Gulf Arab states are trying to diversify their economies away from oil and gas, and they have their own national visions for achieving such economic development and diversification. This requires stability so that the GCC members will successfully attract tourists, investment, and business from overseas. So again, they don't want this conflict with Iran to escalate further, but they also want to deter Iran from carrying out more missile and drone strikes against targets in their countries. So they have to strike a very delicate balancing act right now, which is going to be difficult for them to do. I think a real risk that Iran has chosen to accept has to do with the fact that these GCC states now might double down on their alliances and partnerships with the United States to protect them from what they see as a threat from Iran. But I don't know if that's going to happen across the board in the GCC. What I see among the 6 member states of the Council is a little bit of a spectrum. On one side, we have Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As 2 countries, they did not welcome the US and Israeli decision to start the war, but now 27 days into the conflict, they have to deal with the reality of this war and its effects on the Gulf subregion. And they have chosen, on one side of that spectrum, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to be quite supportive of the Trump administration's aggressive and hawkish wartime posture toward Iran. On the other side of the spectrum is Oman, which is very vocal in expressing its very strong disagreements with the Trump administration as well as Israel. And it's really emphasizing the importance of engaging Iran going forward. How the other GCC states fit into this, they're probably going to be in between those 2 ends of the spectrum, a combination of wanting to see certain measures taken against Iran to deter the Islamic Republic from continuing this aggression. But at the same time, I think they're going to realize that there's a need to keep on engaging Iran diplomatically, even if the trust between whatever trust existed between certain GCC states and Iran has been shattered. So obviously a lot more to get into, but I think that might be a good way to at least start today's discussion.
Thank you for setting the context comprehensively and explaining the intra-Gulf nuances. Picking up from what you just said, another question that pops up about the Gulf is also about Oman's role. Oman has long positioned itself as a neutral interlocutor between Washington and Tehran, but the current conflict may test the limits of the role. So my question here being, can Oman maintain its position as a diplomatic bridge, especially when countries like Turkey and Pakistan have come forward, put their hats into, playing the mediator role? So how do we see Oman's position here?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question. To begin, I think we should certainly appreciate the history here. Oman was a founding member of the GCC back in the early 1980s when the GCC was formed due to 2 main historic events, one being the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the second being the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that same year. Those were the events that prompted the 6 Gulf Arab monarchies to come together, form the GCC. And the thinking was that collectively these 6 Arab states, very hydrocarbon-rich Arab states, could better protect their interests if they acted collectively through this sub-regional institution, the GCC. So Oman was a founding member, but Oman has always maintained a very independent foreign policy rather than feeling pressured by other GCC states to align closely with Saudi Arabia's positions that have typically been very anti-Iranian. Oman has always seen Iran as a neighbor, as a friendly country, and Oman has always worked very hard to maintain cordial ties with with Iran, despite being a founding member of the GCC. We saw in the Iran-Iraq war, Oman was not on the side of Iraq, as most other GCC states were. Oman had a neutral stance in that conflict, and Oman hosted secret ceasefire talks between Baghdad and Tehran that helped wind the conflict down. Later on, we saw Oman be the one GCC state that refused to intervene militarily against the Houthi rebels when the Saudi and Emirati dominated Arab coalition began fighting in Yemen back in 2015. Also, 2015 was the year we saw the JCPOA come into effect. Those nuclear talks between the Obama administration and Iran began in Oman, with the Omanis hosting American and Iranian officials to begin those talks. So basically, Oman has for many decades served this bridging role between Iran on one side and Arab and Western countries on the other. So the fact that after the Trump administration and Israel began the war on Iran late last month, the fact that there were drone attacks against Oman certainly alarmed and surprised many observers who recognized that for many decades, Oman was very friendly to Iran. And it really spoke to the extent to which Iran was committed to wreaking havoc in the Gulf, that even Oman was one of the targets of Iran's retaliation, despite the fact that Oman played no role. Not only did it not play any role in facilitating the US war on Iran, Oman bent over backwards to try to avert this conflict. Both in 2025 and earlier this year, Oman was hosting the talks between the Trump administration and Iran, aimed at bringing the two countries back into a deal. So it was, as I said, and I'll repeat again, it was very shocking to see that these sites, these port cities in Oman, were targeted by drones that Iran purportedly fired at Oman. However, I think we should point something out that's rather interesting here. There are many people who do not believe that Iran was behind those attacks on Oman. In Oman, there are many people who are very convinced that actually the Israelis were behind those drone attacks, and the supreme leader of Iran denied that his country had anything to do with those drone attacks on cities in Oman. I think there were something like 12 or 13 countries that got hit purportedly by Iran after the US and Israel launched this war. And the supreme leader claimed that the attacks on Turkey and Oman did not originate from Iran, but he fully acknowledged that Iran was behind the attacks on the other 5 GCC states: Azerbaijan, Iraq, Jordan, and of course, Israel. So the fact that the supreme leader denied that Iran carried out these strikes on Oman has made it easier for Muscat to maintain a very normalized relationship with Tehran. And the Omanis are very interested in not allowing those drone strikes, whoever carried them out, to create too many problems for Oman's relationship with Iran. And to really underscore this point, let's note that after Mustafa Khamenei replaced his father, following his father's assassination on February 28th, Sultan Haitham, the Omani leader, was the first Arab head of state to officially congratulate the Islamic Republic's new supreme leader on coming to the helm. So that really underscores Oman's commitment to maintaining its special role in the GCC as the Council's most friendly country toward Iran. And Oman and Iran have remained, their officials, their foreign ministers, and their diplomats have been talking every day since February 28th. And what we see is that Oman is working with other countries, such as you mentioned. These include Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, in trying to widen the space for diplomatic engagement. And Oman is also trying to de-escalate as much as possible in the Gulf, specifically in and around the Strait of Hormuz. And it is, of course, Oman and Iran are the two countries on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz. So Oman has very vested interests in maintaining cooperative ties with Iran, given that these two countries are located on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz. And we also need to note something else about Oman's determination to maintain normalized and healthy relations with Iran, is that inside Omani society, there is a fair amount of sympathy for Iran. And this has a lot to do with the genocide in Gaza. From October 23 onward, many in Omani society have become very vocal about Gaza. When you go to Muscat and other parts of Oman, you will often see pro-Palestine rallies taking place. You'll see many Palestinian flags. Anti-Israeli sentiments have really shot up in the country, and there are more pro-Iranian, pro-axis of resistance, and pro-Houthi narratives that you hear in Omani discourse. And this is reflected largely, the government has, I think, taken stock of where public opinion is in Oman, and we see this today with the Omani government refusing to really single out Iran, even after the first few drone strikes on Omani territory. Officials in Muscat condemned the attacks on Oman, but they never mentioned Iran by name until I think the third or fourth attack, which actually resulted in 2 Indian workers in Oman's city of Sohar being killed by the drone strikes. But the point is, Oman went out of its way to avoid singling out Iran. The thinking in Oman is that this current crisis in the Gulf and the Middle East at large is going to have to be resolved diplomatically. And therefore, it's in the interest of regional states to avoid measures right now that would needlessly escalate the situation. So Oman has tried to keep its channels of dialogue open with the US on one side, with other GCC states as well, and also keeping those channels to Tehran open. So basically, Oman believes that this conflict will require engagement between all the different countries that are involved, and Oman remains fully committed to playing its historic role as a diplomatic bridge, even at a time when it is extremely challenging for any country, including Oman, to play such a role.
That is quite insightful. Thank you. Jumping to the other end of the region, we are curious about Turkey's position and interests. amidst the ongoing war. The conflict has had mixed implications for Turkey, creating both economic pressures as well as potential strategic openings. So, in your view, what has this conflict meant for Turkey, and how has it impacted Ankara's interests?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really important to look at the role that Turkey is playing in this conflict. Like the Gulf Arab states, Turkey did not want to see the United States and Israel attack Iran, and we saw officials from Ankara, including the Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan, put a lot of effort into lobbying the Trump administration to pursue a diplomatic approach to Tehran and to avoid going down the path of war. Turkey obviously shares a 312-mile border with Iran. Turkey was very concerned that if the US or Israel would wage so-called limited airstrikes against Iran, the regional fallout would be anything but limited. We know that during the 2010s, after the Syrian civil war erupted, there were 4 million refugees from Syria who were living in Turkey as a consequence of that conflict. That created many economic, societal, and strains and security challenges. So the last thing that Turkey wants is a huge flow of Iranian refugees coming into Turkey. Also, probably the most sensitive dynamic here has to do with militant Kurdish groups in Iran. If there is a chaotic breakdown of the Iranian state, if there is state fragmentation in Iran, certainly from the Turkish perspective, there are risks of Kurdish groups in Iran taking advantage of the turmoil. That could have direct repercussions for Turkey with its own Kurdish issues. And of course, Turkey has deep economic relationships with the GCC countries, so the potential for a conflict to bring instability into the Gulf or for the Strait of Hormuz to be closed would be very problematic for Turkey, which certainly depends on importing hydrocarbons. So these are among the national interests Turkey had, and seeing to it that the tensions between the US and Iran would be resolved through diplomacy rather than war. So fast forward to February 28th, the Turkish and the Gulf Arab efforts to persuade Trump to not bomb Iran clearly failed. The Trump administration chose to do what Netanyahu wanted and start the war. So Turkey has now had to deal with the reality of this conflict, which is taking place right on its doorstep, again, being a direct neighbor to Iran. And Turkey has been very balanced and very careful in how it has been responding to this conflict. President Erdogan was quick to condemn the US and Israel for bombing Iran. And on day one of the conflict, when the supreme leader of Iran was assassinated, Erdogan was very quick to express condolences. But at the same time, Turkey has criticized Iran for not reading the mood in Washington the right way in the lead up to this war. The Turkish government's view is that Iran should have been willing to make some more concessions to the US to avoid the scenario that we're in right now. And Turkey, which is very close to Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf Arab monarchies, has not held back when criticizing and strongly condemning Iran for waging missile and drone attacks on military and civilian sites in the GCC countries. So what Turkey wants to do right now, it's actually not totally dissimilar to the Omani approach, if you will, in the sense that Turkey wants to see this conflict end as quickly as possible. And so the foreign minister of Turkey has been engaged in shuttle diplomacy, constantly in touch with his Iranian counterparts, and also in touch with the Trump administration and Arab states and European Union members trying to see to it that Turkey can help facilitate a diplomatic resolution to this war so that the conflict can stop as soon as possible. I think what we also have to consider, though, is that Turkey's relationship with Israel has greatly deteriorated in recent months, recent years. Turkey has been very critical of the genocide in Gaza. At the same time, as a result of the Assad government in Syria falling from power in late 2024, we have seen Turkey fill a void created by Iran's relative decline in the Levant due to the fall of Assad and the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so as Turkey has become a more assertive player in Syria, Israel has seen that as a threat. And now Turkey and Israel are the two main foreign powers competing for influence and geopolitical clout in post-regime change Syria. All of this is to say that Turkey believes that if Iran would fall, or if there would be a decisive Israeli victory in this current war, Israel might turn its sights to Turkey and possibly attack Turkey, believing that Turkey is a threat to Israel. So there is a scenario right now that very much concerns Ankara, which would be one in which the United States decides to end its operations against Iran, but Israel continues to attack Iran even after American operations come to an end. At that point, it would be more difficult for Turkey to play a role in winding down the conflict through facilitating dialogue between the different actors. So Turkey's hope is that when the United States ends its military operations, and again, Ankara wants that to be as soon as possible, the Trump administration will also pressure Israel to end its operations too. So that is certainly one of the that's certainly a very strong desire that Turkey has right now. I think Turkey is in a unique position right now to play a successful role, diplomatically speaking, because Erdogan and Trump have a very good relationship. The U.S.-Turkey alliance is very complicated. There are many areas where the U.S. and Turkey work together closely, and there are also many areas that are the source of intense friction between Washington and Ankara. But in terms of the relationship at the presidential level, Turkey's President Erdogan and Donald Trump do have a good relationship. And at the same time, Iran and Turkey have what I would call a cooperative rivalry. But nonetheless, Turkey does not view Iran as an enemy, and Iran is always interested in maintaining a pragmatic relationship with Turkey as a neighboring country. So Turkey has unique cards to play. And just one final point I'll make on this topic of Turkey's role in the region. There were 3 episodes on March 4th, 9th, and 13th in which there were missiles directed toward Turkey. And the common interpretation in the United States was that Iran fired those missiles to put pressure on Turkey to close down the American military base in Incirlik. However, NATO was able to successfully intercept those missiles. As I mentioned earlier, there were 2 countries that were targeted by missiles and drones that the Iranian supreme leader said Iran had nothing to do with. Again, Oman and Turkey. I don't know the truth as to whether or not those missiles directed at Turkey came from Iran or some other country. I do not know. But the fact that Iran's supreme leader denied that his country had anything to do with the launch of those missiles toward Turkey that was an important development that made it easier for Ankara to stay neutral in this conflict. If Iran were to claim responsibility for firing missiles at Turkey, that would certainly put some pressure on Ankara to align more closely with the United States against Iran. But Turkey like I said, very focused on being neutral in this war, very focused on trying to play a diplomatic role, which is productive in terms of winding the conflict down, has been able to benefit from the fact that Iran denied that it launched those missiles toward Turkey, and this will help Turkey and Iran avoid any escalation of tensions that exist between the two of them. So in sum, Turkey did not welcome this war, and it is trying to do everything it can to help the parties move toward a resolution of the conflict as quickly as possible.
Thank you for the deeper insights on the role of one of the non-Gulf power centers in the region. My last and cardinal question to you is on the larger US-GCC relations. The war has brought sharper focus on the US-GCC dynamics, particularly around security coordination and regional expectations. So the question is, how has this war impacted US-GCC relations? What could be the future?
Yeah, great question. I think that as a consequence of this war, the Gulf Arab states, really all six of them, are going to have a lot less confidence in the United States as a reliable security guarantor. Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier, the GCC states were very realistic about how this war would negatively impact the countries on the Arabian Peninsula. And what we've seen over the past 27 days is that all of their concerns proved to be extremely valid. And they invested a lot in their relationships with the United States, with Trump in the White House. We remember in May 2025, Trump did his famous Gulf tour, came to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, deals and MOUs to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars were signed in various sectors: defense, AI, energy, aviation. And I think the Gulf Arab states, seeing Trump as a businessman who's very transactional, they believed that signing these massive deals with the United States would secure a lot of influence for the Gulf Arab states in the Trump White House, and that as a consequence of these huge deals and MOUs, the GCC states would be able to persuade Trump to do certain things in the region in certain ways. And they wanted to see to it that there would not be a war with Iran, and they tried very hard to convince him to pursue a diplomatic path with Iran. And the fact that he totally disregarded their concerns and their warnings and their advice, and chose to take advice from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and start the war, this has informed a perspective in the Gulf that Trump is very indifferent to the security of the GCC states. And over the past, nearly 1 month, we've seen the Gulf basically on fire with these Iranian missiles and drones hitting these sites, in these important sites in the GCC countries. And the US, as the security guarantor, has not been able to keep the GCC states safe. It is important to note, though, that the perception of the US as an increasingly unreliable security guarantor did not begin late last month. This has been a growing perception in the Gulf for many years. I would say going back to 2003, when the US invaded Iraq against the warnings of most GCC states. I think that was a moment that began to inform this Gulf Arab perspective that the US tends to bring more instability rather than stability to the region. And then, of course, during the Obama presidency, the US responded to the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and other countries in manners that unsettled the Gulf states and caused them to question the extent to which the US was going to be committed to defending the regimes in the Gulf region. We also saw with the way in which Obama handled the Syrian crisis, and then with the Iranian nuclear talks, further contributed to growing doubt in the Gulf about Washington being a reliable security ally. Then, of course, as I mentioned, there were the events of 2019 during the first Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. Then early 2022, the Houthis carried out attacks on Abu Dhabi, and the view in the UAE and other GCC states was that the Biden administration failed to come to the UAE's defense in the aftermath of those attacks on the capital of the country. So then by the time we get into late February of this year with the launch of Operation Epic Fury, we're basically now at a point where I think GCC states do not see the US as a security guarantor that is effective whatsoever. The dilemma, however, is that the Gulf Arab monarchies do not have another country in the world that they can turn to replace the US as a security guarantor. There are no other countries, global powers, that have A, the willingness, and B, the capacity to take over this role. China is a country that is very friendly with Iran, and China does not like to get involved militarily in the Middle East. China's interests in the Middle East have much more to do with economics, investment, commerce, and trade. If there would ever be a scenario where a country would attack Saudi Arabia or invade Saudi Arabia or any other GCC country, China would not want to be involved in that conflict militarily and take responsibility for the defense of any of those GCC countries. Russia is very bogged down in the Ukraine conflict. And I think after the fall of the Syrian government in late 2024, there's a thinking among Arab policymakers that Russia was a very ineffective security guarantor for Syria. When it comes to the European powers, I don't think the Gulf Arab states really have any confidence in them to replace the United States as a security guarantor. So the American defense umbrella is very far from ideal. It's very problematic, but I think the 6 GCC states understand that in the near term, they don't have any other options. And often in international relations, countries make decisions not because those decisions are optimal, but because there are no better options on the table. So moving forward, at least throughout the remainder of this year and probably this upcoming period, the GCC states are going to continue to work closely with the Americans and to try to strengthen defense cooperation with Washington. But it's taking place at a time in which they have very little, if any, confidence in the United States to protect them. And there is real resentment on the part of the Gulf Arab states toward Washington, specifically toward the Trump administration, for choosing to completely disregard their concerns and to wage this war against their warnings. What is particularly troubling to the GCC states now has to do with a concern that's very widespread in the Gulf, that Trump is going to declare a victory in this war against Iran very soon and end Operation Epic Fury, but that will not bring about an end to Iran's aggression against the GCC states. They worry that the US operations will come to an end, but Iran is going to continue to wage a sustained low-intensity campaign of violence directed against the Gulf, in which they will fire missiles and drones, maybe less frequently than what we've seen since February 28th, but periodically fire missiles and drones at the Gulf states, maybe wage cyber attacks against them, and that this is going to continue, and the Gulf Arab states are going to be on their own to deal with this Iranian aggression. So the bottom line is there's a view in the Gulf that the United States created a catastrophic crisis in the Gulf and is going to leave the GCC states to deal with the mess on their own. And this is something that's very, very disturbing from the perspective of all 6 GCC countries.
Thank you for that mighty food for thought, Mr. Giorgio. With this, we can now quickly open the floor to audience. I kindly request you to raise relevant questions, mostly on West Asian or Gulf perspectives or the larger focus of today's webinar. You can either raise your hands virtually or type in the questions in the chat box. Gahi, please go ahead.
Hello, Giorgio. Thank you for such an insightful session. It was really very informative, and your perspectives were really an eye-opener and made us, I'm sure, made all of us think for a moment or two. So, coming to my question, is you mentioned in detail that Oman's role as a very quiet but credible mediator, or you know how Oman has good relations across the GCC regions. However, if we situate this alongside India's growing diplomatic activism in the GCC, like how India has even friendly relations with almost, if not all, but most of the GCC countries, do you see a structural limitation that is preventing India from translating its stakes into Gulf in the state to actual mediatory leverage. Like, or alternatively, if I have to put it, is India's status quo or India's relation in the Gulf is can it be a stabilizer or can it realistically evolve into something like a conflict shaper or a mediator shaper or a dialogue developer actor or something that can be worked out with Oman.
Mhm. Great. Should I take a few questions at once or respond to each question as they come?
You
Yeah,
can
you
respond.
can now respond to Gagi's and we can have the questions coming in while.
Sure. I think if I understand your question correctly, and please let me know if I misunderstood anything, you were asking if I think that there is real potential for India to emerge as more of a mediator and is more of a diplomatic heavyweight in the Gulf sub-region.
Yes.
Um, I think that there is real potential because when you look at the very deep relationships that India has with all six GCC countries, whether we're talking about energy ties, trade, defense, counterterrorism, so socio-cultural people-to-people relations. There is a lot of influence that India has in the Gulf. I do think, though, there are questions to raise about what India sees as its purpose in the GCC countries. And I think sometimes there are questions among Arab states and specifically GCC states as to what India sees as its vision for the Gulf and the greater Middle East. And I think probably until there is a clearer sense as to what India sees as its vision, its foreign policy vision for the Gulf, there may be some limits as to how much confidence GCC states have in India's maybe not so much capacity, but more willingness to step up as a diplomatic heavyweight in this part of the world.
I would quickly like to follow up with another question.
Mhm.
So, in the last segment, you mentioned that how GCC countries, especially UAE and UAE, Qatar, and other countries, they are not so happy with USA's security umbrella, but there is no other better option, and this is the best, that's available. Do you think this conflict, this war, is a watershed moment for GCC countries into rethinking, going down the self-reliant and securitizing themselves using the means they have and not being reliant on external actors like USA and China? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, as I mentioned, for many years, the Gulf Arab states have been um, increasingly concerned about the risks of being so dependent on the US for security. As I mentioned, there were those previous episodes in the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years that prompted GCC states to question the wisdom of counting on the American security umbrella so much. And there has been a desire on the part of these GCC countries to diversify their partnerships and alliances beyond the United States and to become more independent from Washington. I think this war is going to accelerate that trend. It's not the beginning of the trend, but it will prompt them to, well, in my opinion, it's probably going to prompt them to intensify efforts aimed at diversifying alliances and partnerships around the world, investing more in defense relationships with countries such as Turkey, Russia, France, the UK, and China. I think we can certainly expect that. And at the same time, I believe we are likely to see um, a new period of more militarization in the Gulf, in which these countries try to build up their own militaries and their own defense systems so that they can protect their countries from external threats. And by the way, I want to point out that when I say external threats, I'm not just talking about Iran. Let's not forget that in September of last year, Israel waged a military operation against Doha, and in some other GCC states, there are concerns that they could be targeted by Israel in the future. So when I say external threats, I'm talking about both Iran and Israel. And I think we'll see GCC states invest more in their defense, their national defense capabilities to try to move toward a point of being able to deter external actors from attacking them without having to be so dependent on the United States for that type of deterrence. That is not going to happen overnight. That takes time. The GCC states know that they will have to spend many years pursuing this type of deterrence. But I think as a consequence of everything that's happened since February 28th, I believe the GCC states will be more serious about these efforts. And we're going to see, like I said, sort of a new period of militarization in the Gulf taking place.
I have two quick questions from the audience. Though these are interrelated, so I'll read them both together so that you can. How do you think the conflict could reshape Gulf thinking on energy security, particularly around redundancy in export routes beyond the Strait of Hormuz? Are we likely to see accelerated investment in alternative corridors such as the Red Sea or Eastern Mediterranean? This is question one. The other question being, could competition from alternative trade corridors, such as those through Turkey, change how the Gulf states position themselves as global transit hubs?
Yeah, really important questions. We should, first of all, start talking about Saudi Arabia here. It is the one GCC country that has a Red Sea coast. And, as everyone knows, these concerns about a closure of the Strait of Hormuz are not new. Policymakers in the GCC countries have long considered scenarios whereby Iran shuts down the strait. And in the early 1980s, when the Iran-Iraq war was taking place, the Saudis were very worried about a scenario whereby the Strait of Hormuz would be shut down or at least obstructed by Iran. So the kingdom invested in the east-west pipeline, linking the oil fields of eastern Saudi Arabia to a port on the Red Sea. And that pipeline has become increasingly important to Saudi Arabia since February 28th. And also there is another pipeline in the UAE that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz through the Emirate of Fujairah. And the UAE has been increasingly using that pipeline since February 28th. At the same time, GCC states are looking to Oman, which is the one GCC country that exists on the Gulf of Oman, Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean side of the Strait of Hormuz, not the Persian Gulf side of the strait. So there has been growing talk for years between Saudi Arabia and Oman, and I guess we could probably say by extension the other GCC states in Oman as well, in using the port of Duqm on Oman's Arabian Sea coast to access the Indian Ocean and by extension Asian markets for exports and imports as well, so that the GCC countries will become less dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. I think to get to your question, there is going to be a lot more focus on these options now as a consequence of everything that's happened over the past 27 days. This current conflict has really exposed the vulnerability of the countries in the Gulf that are totally dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, being Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. They have to now seriously consider these other options. Even if the Strait of Hormuz is opened again, we've seen what Iran is capable of. And if there is another conflict in the future, Iran could potentially repeat these types of actions. So they are really having to approach energy security in a very different manner at this point.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we can end our question and answer session now. This is an ocean of a subject and we might need hours together to discuss this, but we are extremely, well, it's a pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much, Mr. Giorgio. Many of us have watched your interviews on news channels, and to hear you directly, although virtually, is quite the experience. And thank you so much for that. And we hope to have similar engagements in the future with you. I also thank all the participants for joining us today, even if it is in the later hours of the Indian time. Hope you all, received enough insights and, ideas from Mr. Giorgio's presentation. And I thank you all for joining us. With that, let us call it a day. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Giorgio.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine. Really an honor to be with all of you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.